Yeah, no, there's a whole chapter about the different energetics of all the animal foods and all the different groupings of
Right.
animals, you know, and how they are medicinal. But I think the difference is
Okay.
that meat is not a part of your daily diet. You know, it's like if there is something that needs to be remedied and meat can be used, then, you know, it's cooked into some kind of preparation. But nobody's sitting down with like a steak. You know, it's not that kind
Right.
of thing.
It's more
Yeah,
like it's used as in medically rather than, you know, just like,
right,
yeah, like I really fancy a burger right now.
right,
Right.
right.
I mean, what does? Okay, so and then loose. Like, if you have a loose stool, what does that signify? You need more hard, cooling things.
Cooling and calming. It's like the digestion's
Right.
overactive, so we need to calm it
Right. Okay.
down. And sometimes
Calm it.
there's
Right.
actually
Yeah.
too much oil at play there. And so you can see if
Hmm.
the stool is oily, you know, you'll see like an oil slick going
Right.
on. And then that often happens if you eat like fried food, you know, obvious stuff.
Right.
So if, you know, the stool gets hot like that, that'll happen if you overeat spicy food. You know, a lot of people think like the Indian restaurant is Ayurvedic food, but it's not. It's usually very
It's a nice
spicy.
idea, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, that's not. Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing that we might like to think when we're eating a nice biryani or something. Oh yeah.
right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
Ayurvedic or Atali. What is so? I mean, you know, on a very, it's not too personal, but what does your diet look like? I mean, how do you cook? And you know, and for people that don't have a bunch of time, I remember you saying you don't like to spend much time on your food. I mean, you've got Ayurvedic cookbooks out, but you say yourself you don't like to spend too much time on, you know, cooking a meal. What kind of stuff do you do, and how do you make it quicker for people that haven't really got, you know, much time on their hands, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's why I wrote the Everyday Ayurveda Cookbook. So if anyone's listening and you're like, you want to know, and that is what I eat, like everything in that book, it's just my food that
Yeah,
I
actually, what
codified.
you eat. Yeah, yeah,
Actually, what I
right,
eat,
okay,
you know. So
yeah,
I learned all
yeah,
these
yeah,
principles in India, but then I was kind of like go back and forth between there and the US. So learning how to make the foods in a Western country. So the recipes are not only using Indian ingredients, you know, there's also like local ingredients like oats, you know. So I think a lot, you know, the basis of an Ayurvedic diet is whole grains, you know, like red rice
right,
or oat porridge. I mean, very simple, you know,
yeah,
just simply like porridge is actually amazing. And they call it kanji, but it's just porridge, you know, and you can put digestive spices in it. And I mean, you can eat that all the time. So porridge and dal, which is just using small beans, you know, like mung beans and lentils. Those are the small ones. And zuki beans for our macrobiotic friends. Those are also kind of a small size bean. The
so small
larger
is better, is
bean,
it? Right,
yeah, the larger it gets, the more air is
harder it is to
present.
digest.
Yeah,
Yeah, right,
exactly.
okay, so kind of flatulence and this kind of
Yeah,
difficulty and digestion going on, right? So the small beans,
right.
okay, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
so
generally,
small
you know,
beans.
the reputation of Ayurveda is just cook things to shit, right? Like, you know, really like just cook that stuff. No raw, no, you know, because people often say, oh, you know, it gets, you know, confused the same breath with raw stuff, right? Like eating raw. And I think Ayurveda doesn't like raw so much, right? Hardest to
Right.
digest.
Yeah, again, back to that Agni principle, you know, like the Rig Veda,
Right.
the first text, the first thing it is a prayer to Agni, to fire. And
Yes,
so we
yes,
introduce our
yes.
food to fire before we eat it. That's what cooking is. You know, that's the processing that we do, especially using a flame, you know, like a gas stove would be preferable to an electric stove because there's actually a flame.
Yeah,
You know, so the point
right.
there is that
Hmm.
not only that we introduce the Agni principle to the food before it enters the body, but that it's softened. Hard, like raw
Hmm.
food is very hard, you know, and there's all this chewing, and the body has to break down these hard pieces. Whereas if you imagine like the digestive uh, juice that's created in the stomach, you know, that then goes into the small intestine for absorption. That is the stuff of life in Ayurveda. That is the ahara rasa. It's like the juice of life. And
Okay.
we want that to be fully digested and soft and smooth and not too sour or putrid, which would happen if we ate like too much fermented food, or it sits in the gut too long,
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all this talk about like cooking our food and trying not to like mix together raw things with cooked things
Uh-huh.
and fruits
Yeah.
with food, and then we'll use spices like cumin, coriander, fennel, turmeric. And all of that is to create this ahara rasa in the stomach that then actually circulates via the bloodstream and builds the tissues of the body. So the better that juice is, the better the whole body is, and the less likely we are to have any diseases be able to like get a foothold in these tissues
Right.
because they're healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about food combining? Is there any principles? I mean, you say no, not combining fruits and food, which is an obvious idea, which unfortunately, again, I'm often fail to do, like after a meal. I know it's a terrible idea to eat fruit after a meal, but I just still often do it. Apart from silly things like that, I mean, what about combining, in a positive sense, certain things, and especially as a lot of people these days, you mentioned before, and it's true, are suffering digestive issues. How could one look at using these principles to build up a stronger digestive fire, Agni?
I think the main way we do that is through combinations of spices. Like that is how we strengthen the Agni. So the basic spice mixture that's sort of considered tri-doshic, like everyone across the board could try. It's just that cumin, coriander, fennel, turmeric. And some, like, in my book, I have those. I teach you how to sort of dry roast it and grind it, and then you put it in a bottle and you can sprinkle it, in all your food. And that sort of thing, even if you eat weird combinations, the mixture of spices actually helps harmonize in the gut.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
it's helpful. It's helpful.
Right.
Yeah, and it can be drank as a tea. You can make a tea out of those 4 spices. Just boil them, say a quart of water, a teaspoon of each spice. You boil for 10, 15 minutes, strain that, and sip it along with the meals. That kind of a thing will absolutely harmonize.
Right.
So I call that damage control. So it's like you're sort of eating whatever you want, but then you have this tool also that you're using.
I was going to say that.
Harmonize.
I mean, kind of, then I thought it was flippant. Yeah, can you just, and then eat whatever you want and use this as a kind of like as a catch-all to get out of it? I mean, what happens if you are suffering a little bit from having overindulged, or you've been under the weather, whether it be COVID or monkeypox or whatever else is coming, what kind of principles can you use to kind of give yourself a booster,
Well, I mean, if one is overindulged, the best thing to do is to skip a meal or 2, So
Okay.
if something crazy happens,
Right.
you eat
a
a bunch of
little
cheese
bit of
and fruit.
fast.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be some crazy thing
That's
where you
crazy
drink juice for a week.
in your world, is it? Right.
Yeah, cheese at night. Oh my God.
Yeah, God. yeah, cheese and fruit. Oh, yeah, I better go home and fast for days. Yeah, you should see what I eat.
Yeah.
Right, so a little bit of fasting you recommend, a little, as a cleansing tool if taken, I'm sure, sensibly.
And it's
do
just
you
a
do
meal.
do you do any fasting? Generally, on a regular basis. I was speaking to someone recently this guy Chris Chappell, who I'm interviewed recently. He was saying he was fasting 1 day a week. Every he's done this for 50 years.
Yeah.
He worked out
Right.
he'd kind of not eaten. He worked out he'd not eaten for like 7 years or something crazy like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I used to do that. I definitely used to do a day a week of fasting.
Right.
For me, that's actually not a good idea. I don't have the kind of constitution that needs to fast. I'm too light as it is. So that was me sort of being like the hardcore yogi. And I did that for 5 or 6 years, What I will do is I will just eat khichdi or congee, which we talked about, like a porridge, a simple porridge with those digestive spices. I might just eat that for a day.
Right.
or
Yeah.
a meal, instead of just continuing to eat what I normally eat when I don't feel well. So it's like,
Right.
it's nice because you can just drop into these simple foods and not cause any imbalances by fasting at inappropriate times or inappropriate ways. For
Yeah.
some people,
Yeah.
people who have a heavier constitution, that would be very excellent, for them to not eat once a week would be
Yeah.
ideal. Yeah, but it's not for
Unfortunately, it
everyone.
doesn't usually go that way, does it? It's like the
Yeah.
people that are lighter, they always tell you, I'm doing a fast, and you
Yeah.
look and go, that doesn't seem a good idea. And then vice
Right.
versa. Some people, it's like, they don't think, well, you probably could, that would work well for you. And they're like, oh, no, I don't. I'm never going to do that.
Right. I know, because we gravitate, that's
But-
like baked into Ayurveda, that we gravitate towards the familiar. So light
Right,
people
yeah.
gravitate towards light therapies that may not be helpful, instead of the opposite.
Yes, exactly. So it's a kind of, it's a clever sojourn really into just a wrapping up in terms of the grandstand of the doshas. How do they relate to our body, and why is it that those, as you said, you point out because you're a knowledgeable practitioner, that those doshas tend to draw us into exactly often what's not good for us, right? So a vata person will
Right.
be attracted to the very things that actually aggravate that vata condition, bizarrely enough, right? It won't necessarily inherently seek that balance, And how do you know when you're going too far one way, and how do you bring that back, And I suppose, first of all, to qualify it, like, what are these doshas, and in the first place, right?
So we talked a bit about the 5 elements, right? So those are the building blocks of a body. And they compound into 3 pairs that do physiological functions. So vata is space and air, so it's very light and mobile. So it does all the movement processes in the body, which includes the mind, the digestion, the menstrual process, circulation. All this movement stuff is governed by vata. Pitta is a combination of fire and water, which is hot and moist. And so its main thing is transformation. So it's like your digestive fire and your enzymatic activity and your red blood, and also the intellect, like the intensity of the gray matter in the brain.
Right.
And then your kapha is the heavy, that's earth and water. So it's heavy and moist. So it's like the mucus, the synovial fluid, all of your membranes. And it's also that which kind of holds the homeostasis in the body, where pitta's breaking things apart, breaking things down, and vata's moving things around, getting rid of waste,
so you need them all.
Things where they need to go.
Yeah.
They all do jobs, right? But the reason that they're called doshas, dosha means that which is at fault or that which is faulty. And that's because, through the thousands of years of trial and error, the Ayurveda acharyas could see that anytime the body got into disease process, one of these 3 compounds was at fault. So they have a tendency to get out of balance, which usually means that their qualities become too much. So the vata is very light and cold, so one becomes too light due to things like inappropriate amount of fasting. Right? And then you're unable to sleep, you're drying out and your poop gets weird, and you're constipated, all these things are happening. With the pitta, it's usually too hot. They have a tendency towards inflammation and the loose stool, skin problems like rashes and acne and things like that.
Yeah.
And your kapha types are, it's naturally heavy, dense, moist, a little bit slow. And when that gets out of balance, people are going to have the weight gain and the stagnation, and the difficulty getting going. That's where Ashtanga is a great practice naturally for kapha types, because it's like so mobile. So those 3 are, when one of them its qualities start to increase beyond what is natural for a person's body, that's when we start things get too hot, too cold, heavy. And then there's different sorts of problems that you can imagine, right, that happen when we do that. So that's where vata types are encouraged to eat foods that are warm, and
Yeah.
moist and oily. Your pitta types
Okay.
encouraged to eat things that are cool and calming, and your kapha types are the ones that can enjoy the sort of lighter and drier foods.
Can enjoy fasting and that's a kind of
Exactly.
diplomatic way to say it, isn't it? We're going to enjoy just eating very light salads. But it's kappa. I thought it was kapha. It's kappa, is it?
Well, there's no F sound really in Sanskrit,
Right.
but
Okay. Okay.
but when it
Right.
moved over to the
Yeah.
West,
Right.
everybody's just said that, and
Started to say
it's kind of
kapha.
stuck.
Yeah.
It's
Kapha.
just
Right. Yeah.
stuck. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
honestly,
Right.
there's no right or wrong at
Okay.
this point. I hear people of all different
Right.
sorts say
Say both.
whichever.
Right.
It seems
Yeah.
like they're both fine. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We can move on from there and the Twinkies. So, uh, in terms of the doshas, but basically we need them all. I mean, because there's this, I think there was this kind of trend of a number of years ago, right? Everyone self-diagnosing. Oh, and the best one I think was like, oh, I'm a pitta or I'm a pitta vata, or that's the and it's kind of almost pejorative to say, oh, you're a kapha, no, no one wants to be a
Right.
kapha,
I
right? Or
know.
but I mean, we actually need all these to be balanced, right? So we need to be a combination of all these things, right? And
Right.
I suppose, yeah, I mean, just to round this off with broad brushstrokes, I mean, how might we recognize our doshas, and how might we start to reconcile, I mean, ourselves to trying to create some kind of daily balance? I mean, you've talked about the food a lot, but I mean, would you perhaps
Yeah.
round this off by just talking about other aspects of Ayurveda? Because it's always known about food, but as you mentioned at the start, Patabi Joyce was talking in the Yoga Mala, kind of Ayurvedically, roughly speaking, I suppose, about avoiding busy places and and this kind of thing, overstimulation, right? Vata loves this stimulation. I'm a bit Vata. I think I love overstimulation, but it doesn't work well for me. There's all too much coffee, and then you're going out, and then this kind of thing, right? I mean, it's like there are other guidelines that we can bring into our life to kind of just try and regulate these kind of tendencies that we have to go towards extremes. I think we have a natural
Yeah.
tendency to seek extremes, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things, this is a big place where yoga and Ayurveda overlap is in the sense organs. So one of the main causes of disease, according to Ayurveda, is aside from so there's three causes of disease: the seasonal changes. So that's why we change our food with the seasons.
Okay. Okay.
We drink hot water when it's cold out and cool water when it's hot. And the second cause of disease is misuse of the senses. So when the mind becomes attached to the sense object, so there's your yoga, right? And there is a care of the senses. That's how we avoid the overstimulation. So, we're aware of the stimulation of the eyes, the ears, the skin, the smell, and the tongue. So things like reducing fragrance, artificial fragrance. We scrape the tongue.
Yeah.
We try to eat naturally
Yeah.
tasting foods. We wash the eyes with rose water to keep them cool. And then this application of oil to the skin. Yeah, so the oil to the skin, that's a great one for your yoga people, because it is the most balancing to Vata, and it's also the kind of the number one longevity technique for all bodies. Like it says that the one who practices oil massage does not suffer from old age. That's where it goes into oil in the text.
Well, they kind of say that about everything, don't they? Well, if you practice Mayurasana, you'll live forever and have superpowers. But no, but seriously,
True.
I mean, what kind of people often ask that? How is that the same as the oil bath, the castor oil bath, or is it different to that? Is it just rubbing a different oil on your body every day? Can you explain that a bit further?
It's different. Yeah, you won't hear a lot in Ayurveda about castor oil bath. You will not hear that much.
Okay.
Castor oil is it's used externally, locally, and it's used internally in medicines, but not so much that's specific to people who are doing Ashtanga, I think, a very sort of heating and intense practice. For general, it's usually sesame oil. That's sort of the most Vata balancing. It's the densest and the warmest of the oils. So for people who run cold and are dry, That is an incredibly
Yeah, yeah,
useful practice to apply the sesame oil to the
right,
skin before the shower.
yeah,
And then you take the shower, and
right,
that's that heating sort of moist principle that you add that to the oil. And you can just sort of like soap the hairy
right,
parts, but not necessarily soap off all the oil. Like I think allowing the skin to absorb
right.
it is good, you know.
So you
So
leave it
that
on
kind
for
of
a
thing
while
can be
beforehand?
done ideally. Yeah, ideally you can
Okay,
sort of like, sit around, do your pranayama or something with it on, 20, 30
drenched,
minutes.
right, just full of oil, just sitting there. Just put a towel down or something. Don't sit in your mum's sofa.
Yeah,
Something, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
right, um, right.
Yeah,
So sesame oil before the shower, and castor
yeah,
oil,
yeah,
nothing to do with Ayurveda. Just apart from, yeah, God knows, don't take it internally. All kinds of stuff happen.
yeah.
But I think as a purgative, it is used, right. Right. So that's a great piece of advice. I always recommend people rubbing the oil on as well, just for the joints and just general
Yeah.
health of the body. Yeah, right,
Right,
right.
right. Which, just to
Yeah,
say, for people who do run hot or have like hot skin
yeah,
things, they don't
yeah.
want to use sesame. They want to use probably coconut oil,
Okay,
because that'll remove heat from the body.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know that in India they put it on the head, don't they? Cooling. Kind of
Yes.
put a little bit on the
Right.
hair, and yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple
Right.
of things. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and yeah. Any other little tips before we finish off this interview today? Any other little tips you use in your life that have really helped, or anything specific? I mean, the tongue scraping, I think, has been a revelation for many people. To be frank, I think that many people really swear by
Yeah.
that. I remember
Yeah.
Naruga talking about that for years ago, and I think I got one for. Also, oil pulling. I think that's popular. Is that Ayurvedic?
Yeah.
Putting the oil in the
Absolutely.
mouth and shrink. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Anything
Yeah.
else you can think of that people could include in their routines?
Again, not to harp on the food thing, but I honestly think that a lot of digestive disturbances, I see them healed by waiting to eat until the previous meal has been digested.
Right,
So usually that's a good 4 hours. So I think a lot of people eat too often, and therefore
right,
that ahara rasa that is compromised. It's like you cook half your rice for 10 minutes and then you put the other half in and keep cooking. So half
right.
the rice is too sticky and half is raw,
That's a good metaphor. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
yeah.
I think that people who feel like gassy or bloated, or there's like just weird things going on with the digestion, to try spacing the meals out by about 4 hours. It's different for different people, different depending on the
Yeah,
size of the meal, but in general, like sitting down and having food and then not eating again for a while, and then sitting down and having
right.
food. That's, I think, the beneficial way to
So
take
no
food.
snacks, not too many snacks.
Not
Yeah,
every
okay.
day, not all the time.
Right, okay. I mean, what
Yeah.
how? My last question actually, but it came up earlier, but I didn't mention at the time. Is like, how rigorously do you stick to this? Does one need to stick to it? Do you know what I mean? I mean, people might think, well, Kate, she thinks that cheese and fruit is that's insane. That's a party, So I'm just going, there's no hope for me, right? I mean, that's her,
Right.
like thinking that things are out of control. Then, God knows what I can, what I can do with this. I mean, how often do you break the rules and have a piece of cheesecake or a bit of fruit, God forbid?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think I have two answers to that. One is the 80-20
Sure.
rule.
Yeah.
So you party
Uh-huh.
down 20% of the time, and then the
Yeah.
other,
Right. Hold the fruit.
the other 80, you're trying to like be on your game. But I also have to say, like, if a person is very healthy and they're asymptomatic, like they feel like their digestion is good, their appetite is
Yeah,
good,
yeah,
their skin
yeah.
is good, they feel good, they sleep
Yeah.
well, everything's good, like then there's no need to freak out. Whatever you're doing is working,
Right.
know?
Fair enough.
But
Yeah,
and I am in that place more often now due to 20 years of living this way. That first 10 years after all
Right.
the sickness, I really was very careful, and now I can get away with all kinds of stuff. And I enjoy that, I enjoy that. But I know like when to say when. And I'm like, oh, a little cheese and fruit at night sometimes, okay. You know what I mean? But it's not like my diet that I'm doing that all the time.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
So I can get away with a lot because I live well, you know, and I know my body's signs and I listen to them.
Yeah,
That's the
I think that's
ideal.
part of it as well, isn't it? Yeah, but also listening, because sometimes you kind of know, like, I know like certain things, you know, I mean, like eating watermelon after dinner is not a good idea. I mean, it's done in many countries, right? Like, you know, you give the watermelon, right, in Greece a lot, you know, and I got into this habit, you know, it's in a warmer country, right? It's a terrible idea, and it doesn't affect me well at all. It often gives me stomach cramps, even. But you still one does these things. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And, you know,
right.
You know, and so I think a lot of, you know, I imagine a lot of it is, you know, coming down to knowing what feels good, you know, and doing what feels good. You know, it sounds like such a simple instruction, but it's not always as easy as all that. You know, which I suppose makes it a deeper question in terms of the yoga and Ayurveda. You know, much more widely and generally. You know. In wanting and actively seeking feeling good, right, and knowing what that feels like, even, you know.
Absolutely, I was so in that place of not knowing any of that for myself. You know, I didn't know what it felt like to be satisfied by a meal for a long time.
Yeah, right.
You know, I was kind of scared of food. And I had to learn that, you know, and there was a period of experimentation. Like when I work with people on making diet changes in the way they eat, I'll say, give it 6 months. Give it 6 months and experiment and pay attention and expect it to take that long for one to learn, you know, what feels good and what doesn't. Yeah. And it's a fun, it can be a fun, sort of curious, natural experimentation that leads you to this place where you feel empowered because you know, like, what works and what doesn't. And it's up to you if you're going to eat the watermelon. It's your choice. You can suffer the consequences happily.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. Just know, you know, it's like, I think Nancy Gilger said, you know, one time, like, have the wine, but just practice the next day. You know, just do what you want, but, you know, practice it and, you know, then make your choices, you know, which I think is a great piece of information, really, or, you know, advice, really, right? Like, it's like, don't deny yourself, but make sure you come up the next day and do your yoga or whatever, and then make your choice after the, you know, the night out, you know, and all the excess, right? Like, then decide whether, you know, like, you weigh it up, right? Like, and that's what I suppose what I did in the end, really. It's kind of weigh up, you know, like, is it worth those indulgences?
Right, exactly.
Continuously.
Is it worth it? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. But, and sometimes it is, you know, to be frank, sometimes it is, and, you know, and that, I'll hold my hand up and say, you know, it was a rubbish practice, and, you know, that was all worth it. But, you know, most of the time, as you say, you know, you know, learning how and what feels good is a process, and it's emotional as well, and you know, and I think it is really a huge part of our yoga practices, you know, knowing how our body feels good and what that feels like for our body. So, I mean, thanks, Kate, for coming on. That's really a very informative little chat we've had, and I think people can find you at your website, which is Kate O'Donnell, I would assume, .com. Is that
Kate
right?
O'Donnell.yoga.
We'll put it in the Kate O'Donnell.yoga. Fair enough, makes sense. And right, we'll put it in the notes as well. And anything else coming up? I think you're doing something at Esalen, aren't you?
Kripalu. I teach at Kripalu a lot.
Kripalu, right? Okay.
On the East Coast.
That's too confused coming from. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah, we do have an online.
Coasts, right?
Yeah, it's an online program though coming up June 1st, so people from anywhere could join. Right. We're doing skin. We're talking about skin this time. Yeah. So I mean, there's tons. I'm so always busy. I love working. So yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as me. Don't forget to comment, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
And like, like and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you haven't already on YouTube. All right. Thanks, Kate.